It's already late. We're just going to give a few minutes as people are signing on and joining. And we'll give a few minutes for everyone to come in, and then we'll begin shortly. Okay. Okay, I think we have a good thing. So good afternoon, Tzorayim Tovim. I want to wish everyone, of course, a happy Hanukkah. My name is Rabbi Josh Weinberg, and I serve as the Vice President for Israel and Reform Zionism for the Union for Reform Judaism. And it's a pleasure to be in partnership with the Israel Policy Forum and running this 5-part series on the state of two states, so to speak. Last time we talked a little bit about, sort of a zooming out and looking at the lens of American foreign policy and some of the big issues that are coming together. And today we have, I think, a really incredible opportunity to talk with real experts at a very high level about the relationship right now between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, between Israelis and the Palestinians, looking at that question about what's possible here and what should we understand and know about the current situation on the ground. With us to do that are 3 experts. Hussein Ibish is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and is based living in Washington, D.C. Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen is the director of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And Neri Zilber is a policy advisor at Israel Policy Forum, and they have all authored many pieces, both in newspapers, journals, books, that you can easily Google and see their prolific activity in all of the writings that they have published over many, many years. And I'm deeply honored to be able to sit with this illustrious panel to have this discussion. So with that, let's dive right in. And I think many of us are watching very closely the situation as, let's call it, a major escalation, if not war, coming from May and June of this year, just about 5-6 months ago, which was, we can look at it from many different angles: what was going on in Jerusalem, what was going on in the Temple Mount, Sheikh Jarrah, what was going on in Gaza, what was going on in the what we call the mixed cities within Israel, all of those things. And that the situation, while it did quiet down after a brokered peace, a brokered ceasefire, that there is still a lot of volatility right now. And even just yesterday, the United Nations envoy to the Middle East warned of a growing risk or growing potential of violence to break out, specifically in the West Bank, specifically Palestinian violence. And it was a warning to Israel and to the region to say we need to work to curb that or to prevent that. Lucy, let's begin with you, if I can, and to share with us, just paint a picture of the current situation and the fragility that we're looking at right now. Israel is continuing to operate in the West Bank on a daily basis, and the Palestinian police are working to prevent further escalations. And we think that, is Hamas trying to activate its best there? How can we understand the complexity here of the situation? And just before you respond, I just want to remind everyone that this session, of course, is going to be recorded, and that if you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A section down at the bottom of the screen there where it says Q&A. And we will make sure to both leave time at the end for Q&A, and also if there's a timely question, we will work to address it. So thank you. And Lucy.
Thank you, Rabbi Weinberg, and thank you to URJ and to IPF for hosting this conversation and inviting me to join my wonderful respected colleagues, Hussein Ibish and Neri Zilber. I'll pick up on your characterization of complexity. It is a complex situation. One of the things that I think is interesting is that for years now, analysts have been talking about the potential demise or the fragility of the Israeli-Palestinian security cooperation and coordination arrangement. And I think what you see is, despite when they project that, they're looking quite correctly at the lack of popularity among the Palestinian public for that arrangement. The Palestinian public tends to see the cooperation, the coordination through the lens of enabling the occupation more so than they see any benefit to themselves or Palestinian society. But despite the many differences, and as we know, they are many and run deep, and the issues of contention between Israel, the Israeli government, and the PA, they have a very strong shared interest in combating a common enemy, and that is Hamas. And so I think what you're seeing right now is security cooperation and coordination quite strong in the face of Hamas's star presence, footprint in the West Bank rising. It certainly got a boost after the events of May. I think if you look at some polling, there's some closing of the gap between Fatah and Hamas in terms of how they're seen among the Palestinian public, but still Hamas has gained quite a foothold in the West Bank. And what you're seeing is, certainly at least in parallel, Israel and the PA working to combat that. So concretely, you've seen, I think in the last couple of weeks, you saw Israel arrest, I think, a 50-strong Hamas operative cell that was poised apparently to engage in widespread terrorist attacks. You've seen the PA cracking down on Hamas and others, PIJ, PFLP activists, and not just necessarily arresting people who are poised perhaps to carry out attacks, but also really cracking down on those showing visible signs of support, waving Hamas flags at funerals, at celebrations for prisoners' return. You saw the PA go into Jenin and really try to seize control, replace security chiefs, really with the idea that they had lost control, and you were seeing a lot of public support in the street, Hamas flags waving, etc. And so what you see here is you can't divorce this, I think, from the overall fragility of the PA, something that Israel, maybe that's something we can talk about later, the other elements to that, but that Israel and the PA both share as a concern. The last thing I'd say on this for right now is Hamas is playing an interesting game here, because we may get into Gaza later, but while Hamas is stoking things in the West Bank and looking to gain a foothold and take advantage of some of the weakness of the PA and Fatah, it's also seemingly trying very carefully to maintain calm and stability with Israel and the Gaza-Israel border. So a lot of dynamics and, as you said, complexity at play.
And do Israelis take that security coordination for granted if we say that Palestinians are skeptical of it as a way to maintain sort of the status quo? Can you say something about that? Or maybe Neri wants to comment on that a little bit about how do we see that playing out?
Certainly. I mean, I think Neri may want to jump in on this one. I would just say broadly, as I segue to Neri, that I think there's a different calculation and consideration the way Palestinians see it, certainly, and interact with it, and therefore think about it probably more so on a daily basis than Israelis do. The perceptions are going to be very different, but I'll let Neri jump in, because I know this is something he's given a lot of thought to.
Right. Well, first off, thank you, URJ, and also IPF for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here with my friends Lucy and Hussein. So just to follow on what Lucy said, what do Israelis think about security coordination with the Palestinian Authority and the relative calm we're seeing now in the West Bank? Israelis take it for granted. They take it for granted. When there's no violence, then everything is fine. The status quo is sustainable. And when there is violence, it's obviously at the top of the national agenda for Israelis, but it draws a very, let's say, hardline response, and oftentimes they say, well, there's terrorist attacks or rockets being fired, so we have to entrench even further, and right-wing sentiment usually rises after any kind of security escalation. And really, if we boil it down, I don't think many Israelis fully appreciate or even know that there is ongoing daily security coordination with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. It's just not something that they're aware of. Previous Israeli governments definitely did not emphasize that really important aspect of Israeli-Palestinian relations. Quite the opposite. You've seen previous governments, especially right-wing governments and right-wing ministers and prime ministers, call the Palestinian Authority leadership terrorists in suits. So really, there's no sense that that the security coordination is in the very real interest of Israelis. I would argue it's also in the interest of Palestinians. But as Lucy rightly said, the Palestinians view it very differently. They view it as a kind of subcontracting of the occupation by the Palestinian Authority security forces. They see it as kind of a heavy hand or an extension of the Israeli hand in the West Bank. I personally would quibble with that, but I'm very sympathetic to that point of view. You know, as we all know, the occupation is still ongoing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that the security question here and the security coordination question always comes as sort of the first item of discussion. We're talking about the relationship, and that was, you know, we all know, is, you know, sort of left over from the Oslo process when it began. But Hussein, if I can turn to you and
yes.
To take us a bit beyond and take us into the sort of, if you can, I realize that you are not a representative of the Palestinian people speaking here, but like take us to
not at all.
but take us onto the Palestinian street, and can you analyze a little bit of what's going on in Palestinian politics?
Yeah.
And to say, how's that being affected? There were elections scheduled last May that didn't happen. Why not? What's the prospect for the future?
Okay. All right. So look, the elections were not held because they cannot be held. Right. Nobody wants them. Right. Everybody says they want them, but nobody wants them. So I can't take you onto the street. That's not really what I do, but I can take you into the political space for a second. And here's the reality. The reality is that there is no Palestinian national leadership. Right. That's the reality. You have the PA led by Abu Mazen, by Mahmoud Abbas, who at this point has come to function basically as the mayor of Ramallah and a few other cities. Remember how small the territory he has any authority over, any meaningful authority over, really is. 9% of the West Bank, excluding what Israel defines as Jerusalem. It's a really tiny little archipelago of cities and urban areas that is designed to give the maximum number of Palestinians, give Israel distance from the maximum number of Palestinians without in any way compromising anything that Israel regards as important, including strategic areas, settlements, roads, everything like that. So it's just a kind of, fobbing off, which is why people don't react well to the security forces, because it looks like a situation in which this is what you're going to get. If it were part of a process, when it was seen as part of a process, they were very popular. But now it's seen as the gendarmerie for the long-term occupation. That doesn't sit very well. But Abu Mazen clearly over time has been beaten down. He's become corrupted in a way he wasn't before. He's become authoritarian in a way that he wasn't before. And he's become provincial in the narrowest sense, so that, as I say, he thinks and acts. I mean, he may conceptualize himself as the president of Palestine. I'm sure he does, but he doesn't act like it. And I'll give you a good example. There are many, but the most obvious example is all the efforts, the Egyptian-led efforts, to get the PA back into Gaza, to man the crossings, to take over the ministries, to do this stuff. He has refused to go along with, usually with Israel's support. And it was Netanyahu every time it came up. And he ultimately got Netanyahu's backing for this. Now, he said, oh, it's a trap. I won't have enough money to take care of the people in Gaza. I don't have the resources. It'll be like Hezbollah. Hamas will have all these guns and they'll undermine me. True. It was full of, and I'll have to let Hamas back into Nablus and all these places where they have a lot of support. So I don't want to do that. It's a trap. Right. I understand. He was right. There were lots of risks. Those were all real risks. But if you're a national leader, you take those risks to reassert your national authority. You don't say, oh my God, I can't, That's not what national leaders do. They act with force and determination. So he's not doing that. Hamas is obviously not qualified to lead the Palestinian national movement. They don't accept the PLO's decisions. They do accept the PLO's authority, but they don't accept the legitimacy of their agreements with Israel or other agreements. They're not fit to be an interlocutor for the international community because they don't respect the diplomatic process. They remain a terrorist organization that continues to get banned right now in Australia and in more European countries. And they're only real because their main political stance, the Brotherhood political stance, is the politics of hijab, of head covering, of not smoking, not drinking. Are you married to, it's social reactionary stuff.
Sharia law.
It doesn't have any political content. There's no Islamic theory of taxation. It's just a bunch of religious attitudes, social attitudes, right? That's not terribly popular among Palestinians. And in fact, after the Arab Spring, it was tested in the Arab world. It's not terribly popular in the Arab world either, frankly. Muslim Brotherhood is sort of a dead letter, except in Western Libya and in Gaza. But in order to remain viable, they outbid the PLO on refusing to compromise with Israel, and on violence, and on struggle, and on not giving in to anything. Okay, so they become popular, and the more dire things are, the more popular they become. But neither are they a national leadership, nor are they fit to be a national leadership. They cannot operate on the world stage. They should not operate on the world stage. So we're in this really terrible situation, where on top of not having a national leadership, the Palestinians now are exposed as not having a national strategy either. Because until the Abraham Accord, for about 5-6 years, even longer, before the UAE made its overture to Israel, the Palestinian leaders, the PLO leaders, would always say, if you ask them, what's your national strategy? They would either mention the Arab Peace Initiative or describe the Arab Peace Initiative without using the words. In other words, they were relying on the Arab bloc as a group to incentivize Israel to make a deal with the Palestinians. The minute that breaks with the UAE, it exposes the fact that it is ridiculous to give your national strategy to a group of other people who have other interests and might redefine the strategy in a way that doesn't serve you, which is exactly what happened to them. So they are completely lost. And neither Hamas nor the PA wants elections, and they are very happy with the division of power that they possess, because at least they have something. And they know no way of going forward with the Israelis. They see no light at the end of the tunnel. So the stasis, the fragmentation, the desperation is absolute.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for painting that very detailed and comprehensive picture.
You're welcome.
What I want this to lead to, each of the analyses that you're providing, is a question, as we framed it, about two states and about the sort of where does this all end up. And I want to frame that as sort of the overarching theme of our discussion here, and to say, what does need to happen. And I want that to be sort of our ending, our landing strip.
Can I build on that for a second?
Yeah, but I do want to ask a follow-up question about Palestinian politics.
Okay, yeah, I was going to link it to the Palestinians.
Sure. Yeah, my follow-up question is, if I can just ask you to prognosticate a little bit and to say, as you said, you talked about Abu Mazen, and who we know is 85 years old, not in the best health situation. What happens the day after Abu Mazen?
Okay, I guess we can come back to how the two-state solution affects the Palestinian political scene, or I could give you a very quick answer now, or we can go into succession directly.
Let's say a little bit about succession, and then we'll move on to the...
Yeah, that suits me. All right, so we don't know, all right? Right now, the Palestinian constitution suggests that if there's a vacancy in the presidency, Article 37 suggests that the speaker of the PLC, the Palestinian legislature, would temporarily assume the presidency for 60 days and prepare an election. That's not going to happen for two reasons. First, the PLC hasn't met since 2007. And secondly, when it did exist, Hamas held the speakership. So that's not going to happen. Now, the PLO has kind of worked away, had created a workaround for the PLO and not the PLC to decide the next presidency. But it's very hard to know what's going to happen. Right now, there is a fragmentation in the leadership in the West Bank, right? Basically, you have effectively two camps. It's very hard to know, right? It's really very, very, very hard to know, because all the logical means of succession are either OBE or foreclosed, overtaken by events, no longer valid or foreclosed. You do have, first, it should be said, the obvious national leader of the Palestinians in terms of popularity, credibility, gravitas, is Marwan Barghouti, right? I mean, but he's in prison in Israel.
He's in jail now, right?
He's serving multiple life sentences because he was involved in the Second Intifada, and the losing side goes to prison. So there he is. And, you know, if the Israelis ever decided in the foreseeable future they wanted to do a deal, it would be a Mandela-like situation where they let him out of jail and then they agree to finalize a decision, an agreement that's already 3/4 made, which is basically what happened. You know, but I don't foresee that happening. He would glide into the national leadership pretty easily. Hamas would be very upset, but there wouldn't be much they could do about it. I'm not sure he would be able to rejoin Gaza and the West Bank initially, but he's the obvious choice. But you know, he can't do it if he's in jail. So then you get these two camps, and it's based on the guys with guns. One set of guys with guns is the General Intelligence Chief, Majid Faraj, and his ally, the Civil Affairs Minister, Hussein al-Sheikh, right? And they are closely aligned with Abbas himself and with his inner circle, right? There's a whole bunch of people, well, a small group of people, including Hamid Shtiya, the Prime Minister right now, Nasser Abedin, and people like that who are pretty close to Abbas and would want to succeed him.
And you think these are names that we should be watching for?
Yeah, especially the two I mentioned, Faraj especially and al-Sheikh are the leaders of, if the current inner circle is going to succeed Abbas, either as an individual or as a group or a troika or something, it's going to be because those guys enforce that on the ground. On the other hand, there's a group that's further out than Abu Mazen, but very powerful, which is led by the preventative security chief, Jibril Rajoub, and the intelligence chief, the general intelligence chief, Tawfiq Tariwi. And they might try to create a new coalition outside of Abu Mazen's circle by bringing in, first of all, as a figurehead, Nasser Qudwa, who was Abbas's nephew, right? And used to be
Arafat's nephew, I believe.
Arafat's nephew, that's right. Yeah, Arafat's nephew used to be at the UN, etc. I mean, he doesn't have a lot of strength, but he represents that legacy. So he could be a very good figurehead, and then presumably they would try to be the power behind the throne. Additionally, they could maybe offset the power of the incumbent group by bringing in other outsiders, possibly Mohammed Dahlan, who's strongly aligned with the UAE and could be a pathway to money, and possibly also Salam Fayyad, who retains international credibility and administrative competence that's unrivaled among Palestinians. So those are two sets of groups that have guns, political influence, and are positioned to make a play for leadership. But let me just say this, the problem is we're having this speculative conversation, right? And the reason we're doing it is Abu Mazen has worked tirelessly to make sure there is no obvious successor. And in so doing that, he's protected himself maybe, but he has left the Palestinians again terribly exposed. It's a horrible failing.
Sure. No, very helpful. And also just wanted to think about not only who could be seen as acceptable or to have popularity among the Palestinians, but who could Israel also, work with, whether it's Marwan Barghouti, you painted him sort of being in jail for being on the losing side. I think many Israelis might say, well, he has blood on his hands.
He does. He sure does.
Murdering,
but the people who put him in jail had a lot of blood too. So that's
no, fair enough. I just want you to say, how would that play out?
He's guilty of the crimes he was convicted of. I'm sure of that.
Yeah.
No doubt.
So I want to pivot a little bit, because what we're trying to do is paint a picture of what would need to happen. One is the security cooperation, Palestinian political arena. What does that look like? I want to also think about funding for both. We know that Israel is a massive recipient of United States foreign aid, what we call FMF, foreign military financing. And Palestinians are also, to a much lesser degree, a recipient of foreign aid, which was cut dramatically by President Trump's administration. Neri, would you share with us a little bit your thoughts on what the effect of those cuts, mainly to UNRWA, in the region, and then Neri, Lucy, who also share with us what would need to happen here to regenerate that, and how does that play a significant role here?
Right. So we should say that under the new administration in the U.S., a lot of the funding has come back. So I'll start at the end and then I'll go back to the beginning. So the Trump administration, in a fit of pique in around 2018, cut pretty much all the U.S. funding to the Palestinians. And this is important. It wasn't U.S. funding to the Palestinian Authority. By law, the U.S. can't actually give money directly to the Palestinian Authority. But the U.S. has historically and now continues to give money to 3 or 4, let's say, buckets of aid that help the Palestinians. Number one is UNRWA, which is the UN refugee agency for the Palestinians. The U.S. historically has been the biggest single donor to UNRWA. The second tranche and bucket is USAID for development work in the West Bank. The third tranche, a lot smaller, basically funding for East Jerusalem hospitals, which provide better healthcare to primarily Palestinians. And then the fourth bucket, which was never really discontinued directly by the Trump administration, but was cut off during the Trump administration, is U.S. funding directly to the Palestinian Authority security forces. That's only the real money, that the U.S. money that goes to the Palestinian Authority. All of that was pretty much cut under the Trump administration. We all that follow these issues closely were very concerned. We were very concerned, but we weren't the only ones. The biggest outcry back then, and this is true now, it's true in the past, biggest outcry comes from the Israelis, and specifically the Israeli security establishment, because they know, the professionals on the ground, whose job it is to uphold security and stability on the ground, know how important those various organs and funding and aid and money are to overall stability in the West Bank and also in Gaza, we should say. And so it was very concerning. In terms of UNRWA specifically, the Gulf Arabs and the Europeans stepped in and made up the shortfall eventually. So their funding continued. And now U.S. funding definitely to UNRWA and USAID, and most recently to the East Jerusalem hospitals and the Palestinian security forces are back online. So that's all for the good. And again, there is a direct line. Again, it's not my opinion or analysis, it's the Israeli security guys' analysis. There's a direct line between money and economic prosperity and funding and security. And so what Trump did, what his administration did, was actually quite alarming, quite concerning, but everyone got through it. Now the PA has a different problem. A lot of the donor aid in general has dried up. People seem a bit fed up, both with the current Palestinian leadership, as well as with the overall Israeli-Palestinian conflict that just kind of goes on and on now. And so donor aid wasn't what it used to be. And so the PA itself has a bit of a funding gap, primarily in terms of its ability to pay salaries to its civil servants, including the 30,000 men under arms that are part of the Palestinian security forces. And so it's a concern now and in the coming months whether the PA can actually pay salaries. And again, not to belabor the point, but there's a direct line between these people getting paid and security on the ground. And that's one of the things, along with succession and who will take Mahmoud Abbas's place, that people who follow Palestinian politics closely are quite concerned about.
Yes, and I think that I don't think that anyone's ever said more unemployment will lead to greater relationships or peace.
Right.
You know, I don't think we said it, but sorry.
No, just a final thought. The U.S. funding, you know, it's good on its own merits in terms of stability on the ground. It also brings the U.S. back as a direct player in terms of everything that's happening on the ground. So the Trump administration was really cut off from the Palestinians for several years. And again, that's not a great situation, both for U.S. foreign policy, arguably for Israel as well, and for the Palestinians.
Yeah, that's an important point as well. We're talking about sort of external influences that play a role in the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. Maybe Lucy, will you share with us a little bit about what you're hearing from, you know, from the administration? Is it, you know, is there going to be a Palestinian diplomatic mission in Washington, D.C.? And how much, whether it's a symbol and sort of a symbolic framing there of having a consulate in East Jerusalem, does that play into it at all? And are those steps, you know, how critically important are they?
All of these are important and significant for many different reasons, and these all tie to the question that you've been asking and the topic of this discussion, which is whether the two-state solution and what are the steps that would need to be taken for that to remain possible. To focus on the Palestinian representation either in Washington and also Washington reopening a consulate in Jerusalem, this has become a very contentious issue. Just as Mary has laid out the funding cuts that happened under the Trump administration, the Trump administration did a lot to reframe and to change dynamics on the ground that are meaningful in the context of how you move forward on this conflict. The Biden administration Biden had said during the campaign and has said since he came into office that they would reopen the consulate, which had served essentially as a U.S. de facto representation to the Palestinians. That has hit stumbling blocks. Basically, Israel, the Israeli government has said, no, we do not want to see, we were not going to give permission for that to reopen. And in fact, you will hear the talking point from many in the Israeli government of why doesn't the US first look to reopen the PLO mission if it wants to start reestablishing its relationship with the Palestinians, the PLO mission in Washington. There's complexity there that leads to decisions that have to be taken by Congress. That's not something the administration can just do readily and easily. So as with everything, this is complex. The US administration is not able to easily wave a magic wand and reopen the consulate without going to bat right now with the Israeli government, or without going to bat with Congress here when it comes to reopening the PLO mission. So you can say, well, it's the United States, isn't that what the government and the president should be doing, the executive branch should be doing? And I think that comes down to the political will. The administration does not seem to be has set the bar fairly low in terms of the amount of effort that it is expending at this point of going to bat either with the Israeli government or expending a lot of political capital on taking bold steps to put diplomacy towards a two-state solution back on track. And this gets to your fundamental question of what would it take to do that. It would take
let's go there. Yeah, please. It
would take an alignment of interests and political will by a number of actors, the Israelis and Palestinians themselves, certainly the United States, and alongside other international actors as well, but those I think are your primary actors there. It would take that alignment of interest and political will to do something, and it is not there. And we've laid out many of the reasons why it's not. Palestinian leadership is fragmented. The Israeli government, there's a couple of reasons. The diversity of the coalition is such that they have decided that to stay in power, in governing power, they are not going to touch anything about which they disagree. And fundamentally, the thing about which the multiplicity of parties disagree in the coalition is how to move forward on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so they have no interest in touching that. The Israelis also Israelis on the ground do not feel the sense of urgency to change the status quo right now. The Palestinians, we've heard extensively from Hussein how fragmented the leadership is. You do not have leadership that can take bold, strong steps. And frankly, there are incentives there as well for them, for both sides to more manage the status quo than to do anything bold to shake things up. And if you look at the Arab actors who Hussein alluded to with the advent of the Abraham Accords, if there was any hope that these Arab actors might use this newfound strength of relationship with Israel to incentivize steps forward on this, their incentives aren't there either. They look at the political picture. They know there's not much that's going to be done on the Israeli leadership front by the Palestinians, and they have their own interests to pursue without investing and expending, again, a lot of political capital on doing the kinds of things that would shake up conditions such that you'd be, when I say back on track towards a negotiated two-state solution, certainly putting themselves on the track there. And of course,
right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, if there was some assurance that the expense of political capital would result in something, some positive outcome, then we could say, okay, then it's worth it. But I think, as you're saying, there's not, right?
Right, with anything, this is almost conflict analysis 101, right? When do the parties feel that they've reached a mutually hurting stalemate such that the best alternative is to take the kind of risks, and there are risks for all the parties in doing the kinds of things that they would need to do to push for a two-state solution, and none of the parties are there yet in terms of feeling that mutually hurting stalemate. Now, I'm not at all advocating, you should think what a mutually hurting stalemate might look like. The recipe for that is a lot of hurt and pain.
Yes. I mean, it takes me back to the Cold War politics of mutually assured destruction from one another. That's how maintain the dual hegemony of international relations. But sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah,
no, I would just say that in the meantime, of course, we've talked very much, and we've kept this very much at the calculations and interests of the leadership and what's going on the calculations political level. Of course, left behind in this end up being the publics and on both sides, and certainly on the Palestinian side, the public, where there's no love lost, and again, something that Hussein pointed out, for the leadership, whether it's the Hamas leadership or the Fatah leadership, the thing to watch there, I think, is where attitudes are towards what the future vision is, what the future is at this point for the Palestinian cause, for the Palestinian national movement. They don't see their leaders taking them anywhere constructive. And you see that in the numbers in terms of support for what future outcomes, if not solutions, would look like.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. That, really well expressed, excellent analysis of laying the cards on the table as we speak. Let's ask the same question and hear from others. We know the obstacles, and now I think both Hussein and Neri and Lucy painted really an excellent picture of the current situation with its tremendous challenges that we're seeing. What are the 1, 2, 3, 4 steps that you think are necessary to take, and which of them are in any way realistic of being able to move forward for a situation, I think, that would avoid it all dissolving into one state or into some sort of, it's becoming more popular to say a confederation of states. And I think that both, as the URJ and I know IPF, we think that this two states for two peoples, while not perfect, is kind of the best end result here. And so maybe Hussein, if you would share, and then Neri, also from the Israeli point of view.
I think it's the only way. I mean, two states could be confederated or federated or whatever, but yeah, there's no other way other than two states, and there's different kinds of conflict. So, all right, what can be done on the ground to keep the ball in the air? Well, let me be blunt about this situation. Right now, we're looking at a situation in which I think the main obstacle to having made any progress at all since the Wye River Accord, a lifetime ago, basically a generation ago, is the fact that there is no real pressure on the Israeli public and the Israeli politicians who are answerable to their public, and a situation in which a passionate minority of people can get their way because they care about a certain concession or step, and most people are just whatever, we have other issues. Under such circumstances, it becomes very difficult for Israeli leaders to agree to anything serious, and even more difficult to actually deliver it, right? Because the political pain and blowback is so great, even if you're talking about 20% of people, of your voters, of Jewish Israelis. So, and Palestinians have no leverage over Israelis. They've tried everything. It's all failed. They don't have requisite support. No one's intervening on their behalf, and they themselves can't do it. The power asymmetry between the two parties is without parallel in modern history, as far as I can tell. I can't think of any other national confrontation with this degree of power asymmetry. So right now, the Israeli government or the Israeli state, Israeli society is being asked, in terms of peace, to give up things that a lot of them really, really, really want to keep and that they have already. And they're being asked to give it up because what? Or else what? There's nothing. So they're not going to do it. It's as simple as that. They are not going to do it. They're not going to do it because they lost a debating point. They're not going to do it because of international law. They're not going to do it because it's enlightened self-interest, because human beings don't work like that. They're not going to do it. So under these circumstances, you are headed, we all are headed for a gigantic explosion of violence, and it's virtually inevitable. I think the Israelis I talk to, even very sophisticated experts, are in denial about how inevitable a huge eruption of violence, worse than the Second Intifada, really awful and very hard to contain, how inevitable that is over the long run. When's it going to happen? I have no idea. What's it going to look like? I don't know. But I'll tell you, it's going to happen because people don't just live like this. Now, we can do things to keep the ball in the air. We can do things to postpone and to maybe help avoid it. Okay, because, well, let me just say, until there's hope, which there is none, it's going to happen. If you add hope, that's a whole other story. You can certainly improve conditions on the ground. That's very realistic. People are seriously talking about it. This government in Israel, it doesn't want to talk about fundamentals, but it is talking about doing things to make life better in the West Bank. It is also trying to do a deal with Hamas over prisoners and other things. So just to balance, just so Hamas doesn't get too weak, right? Because it's a balancing act for the Israeli government, which is terrible but true. A really big mistake. I wonder if they'll ever reconsider that, but apparently not. So that sort of thing can be done. What would make the most difference? The simplest thing that would make the most difference is something Israel has never done, something extremely fundamental that goes back to the origin point of the Israeli-Palestinian diplomatic relationship, which is the letters of mutual recognition in 1993. The first Israeli-Palestinian diplomatic gesture was a letter from Arafat to Rabin recognizing the state of Israel on behalf of the PLO, which they have never taken back, and therefore the Palestinians have recognized Israel and its rights. The response from Rabin was to recognize the PLO as a legitimate interlocutor and agree to get into a dialogue. So the one thing that has never happened, ever, is a formal Israeli acknowledgement of a Palestinian right to statehood. That has not happened. And I think that would make a tremendous lot of difference. My fear, though, is that given the fundamentals on the ground, we are headed for not only a confrontation and a conflict, but that the logical, how should I say, the logical concatenation of circumstances that's set up is for Israel to give up, to impose a new reality by force, which it could do, which would mean a new border, a permanent border, and almost certainly involve significant amount of ethnic displacement, ethnic cleansing, a third mass eviction of Palestinians from certain areas, and a fait accompli imposed by force of arms. I really think we're going in that direction. I think it's going to take some kind of a miracle to avoid that.
Okay,
So,
we're getting lots of good questions coming in the chat and coming in the Q&A section. Please keep them coming. We will try to get to as many as we can, but before I do that, I want to turn to Neri also to share from your perspective, and then we'll address the many excellent questions that are coming in.
So I want to inject maybe a little ray of sunshine into this conversation.
Yes.
Not too much, but I'm going to try to frame this in a more positive light. The general perception of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that it's this long conflict that's been going on now for 100 years, and that it's just going to continue on and on and on till either there's an explosion like Hussein mentioned or other scenarios. I would argue that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict changes a lot. It had changed dramatically after 1987, the first Intifada, Rabin's election in the early 90s, 2000, second Intifada, and so on. Ariel Sharon's disengagement from Gaza. The exception really has been the last 12 or so years under both Bibi Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas, where you do have this kind of stasis where people are, and rightfully so, getting a bit fed up, because to their minds nothing changes. It just keeps going on, and we have these very worthwhile but academic debates about the future of the two-state solution, and yet nothing changes. And I would argue that the last 12 years have actually been the exception and not the rule, both on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side for very specific domestic political reasons. Bibi Netanyahu seemed to be kind of the eternal leader and prime minister of Israel. This past summer, that was thankfully proven not true. And Abu Mazen, he's 86 years old. Nobody lives forever, not even Arab dictators. So at a certain point, he will exit the stage, either politically or biologically, and something else will take his place. Now we can get into a conversation like Hussein mentioned earlier about what that succession would look like. I would argue the successor pool is both too big and too shallow. So there are too many contenders and not any one of them in particular have enough gravitas to fill Abu Mazen's shoes. But again, that succession will eventually take place. Now, when that succession takes place, what will the scenario on the ground look like? Will it be more amenable to renewed negotiations with an Israeli government? Again, Israel has a lot of say in that, as do obviously the Palestinians. And we're really talking about elite Palestinian politics here. The people so far don't have a say, and they haven't had a say in their leadership now for 15 years after the last election took place. And also a lot will depend on what Israeli government is in power. Now, here in Israel, again, this past summer, by the skin of many teeth, we avoided a hard right government led by Netanyahu, along with various far right and ultra-Orthodox parties. If Netanyahu and his allies had gotten 70,000 more votes, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. But he didn't, and this change, quote unquote, government took power, predominantly center and center left, along with an Arab Israeli Islamist party. So again, that is change for the better. They're talking a game, a better game in terms of wanting to take confidence building measures vis-a-vis primarily the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, shrinking the conflict, as it were. This is their new paradigm. That remains to be seen how far along this road of shrinking the conflict they want to go. But you could at least sketch out a hypothetical situation where the centrist and center left and left-wing parties in Israel actually deliver to the Israeli public, not on the Palestinian issue, on all the other issues, on all the other domestic issues. And they in turn gain support, and not this government, but the next government or the one after that may be more amenable on its own terms without external pressure or an eruption of violence to actually take the steps necessary to renew negotiations, with an eye to a two-state solution. And again, on the Palestinian side, it depends on what leadership takes its place. But I agree, I think, with Hussein as well as with Lucy, I don't really see an alternative to the two-state solution. And my final point will be that this eruption of violence, right, will likely look a lot more like the first Intifada than the second Intifada.
I agree with that, but harder to contain. Can I just say one quick thing?
Yep.
I think the difference between, I like everything you said, I agree with everything you said, but I see this situation as much more structural in a formal sense than these personality changes would deliver. You can break through, but it's really hard. It's not as simple as Sadat. This is the structure.
Nobody said it was going to be easy. This conflict has been going on for 100 years. It is the longest running conflict in the world for good reason. However, it will take, to change that dynamic, it will take leadership from above, like we've seen in the past.
I agree with that.
And the political context, both in Israel and Palestine, will determine it. And I don't think it really will depend on which American president pulls what lever. Unless it's someone like, a far left president, and again, if the Europeans pull out all funding to the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority, that could also have an impact, but I don't think the Europeans are going to leave the Palestinians high and dry. So again, we're talking about hypotheticals, on the ground, the politics, do change.
There's no doubt the structures are created by human choices. That's true.
Let's let Lucy, please. Yeah.
No, I would say that while it will take leadership from above, in the absence of that, and we've seen that that's not there, it is important to look at what might come up. Where is the boiling point of frustration from below, and what does that lead to? I mean, I will agree, Neri, you said, I too tend to see the two-state solution as the most sustainable solution to this conflict. But as we know, that's not what all the indicators on the ground are pointing to in terms of where this is heading. And we've been, it's been a number of years, people use all sorts of analogies. The door is closing, the window is closing, and nobody's ever defined where that point is. But I want to get back to a point, I think it was Hussein who said earlier, in the absence of a process And in the absence of hope, I think he mentioned, dynamics happening on the ground. He was talking, I think, about security cooperation at the time, have a very different complexion when they're situated within a process and a political horizon. And part of the challenge with this shrinking the conflict effort is the Prime Minister of Israel has been very clear that he is both interested in what he terms shrinking the conflict. At the same time, he is absolutely not interested in pursuing a two-state solution or a Palestinian state. So whatever benefit one might get, and I'm sure there are benefits to there have been economic benefits, there have been probably some tangible improvements on the ground in the lives of some Palestinians with some of these steps. But it really can only go so far as long as it is not attached to a political horizon and framed within a context of hope that this is moving somewhere beyond perpetual occupation and management of a situation. And I think that is what we're looking at right now, at least how it is being framed, because everybody, as I said before, has retrenched to management as the easiest course right now. And so again, I think, yeah, go ahead, Neri.
No, Lucy, I don't disagree. I will say that management isn't the easiest course, it's the only course. In other words, the politics in Israel, this government will fall and will go to yet another election if they push too hard on various things that we all want to see happen. So it's just a political reality in Israel currently with this new government, as well as in the Palestinian Authority, where Abu Mazen is on his way out. Everyone's concerned about succession. There are only so many steps and things that he can do in terms of, some future hypothetical peace process. So again, it's a waiting game in Palestine as well until the old man leaves the scene, and then we have to see who takes his place. My argument is that, managing the conflict or shrinking the conflict, as bad as some may make it out to be, and I'm not a huge fan of that paradigm, will it improve the situation enough to show some hope, like Hussein said, that the next guy who takes over in Palestine will actually be beholden to a lot of the positive policies that Abu Mazen has followed over the past 15 years, or will he actually look to make a break and escalate and confront Israel if there is no actual positive movement, tangible positive movement on the ground? And my fear is that.
I appreciate that. I just want to get to some of the questions in the time that we have left. Short time. There's some excellent questions. And two questions that I'll throw out and just open to anyone. One is, let's say that there's a Palestinian state. Just help us understand what that might look like. And we've all seen the various maps, from Oslo up into Ehud Olmert and Abbas, the Trump plan, not plan, all of those. What would it look like? And with that, as we're talking about reality on the ground, what do you think it would take to, this is a question that came in, to break free of the influence or the dominance of the settlement movement? And we just saw the president of Israel light Hanukkah candles in Hebron, no less.
The worst settlement of them all.
Right. The Park Hotel in 1968.
The ugliest settlement in the whole place.
Yeah. So what do we think both the state would look like and the dominance of the settlement movement in Israeli politics?
I'll be very quick. I can't imagine it. I mean, I can imagine what it would have been in 1996 or 98, but I just can't imagine it right now. I mean, if we could, look at the maps. The maps are clear. That's what a Palestinian state would look like. 3 to 4% land swap. Jerusalem not divided, but Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. A non-militarized Palestinian state, which the PLO has always wanted, well, not always, but since 93 wanted, and some fudging of return, and there you go. But I don't think that's available because I think it's asking too much of the Israelis to give all of that up without any pressure on them, and they're not going to do it. Human beings just don't.
Okay, hey, Lucy, yeah.
I just would say I don't have much to add to what Hussein laid out there, except for the fact what's interesting is that if you think about, you mentioned the Trump plan, you think about the Trump administration, that sort of marker that was put down when President Trump said, 2 states, 1 state, I like the one that both parties like. It is interesting that the Trump plan ended up essentially nodding and trying to frame it as a two-state solution. There was some acknowledgement in there that there is no way to square this circle without a two-state outcome. Now, what they did, to my mind, is emptied out the term of, it's sort of an empty vessel of a term, two states, if you can put anything into it, and sort of what do you call a state? So in terms of what Hussein mapped out, that would be a viable two-state arrangement. And we all know the diplomatic history of the offers that have been put on the table, and the different parts each party has played in those not going anywhere. But I think it's clear what it would need to look like, what the bare minimum would be. And again, it gets back to the political will. And in the meantime, public support for it, while it kind of goes up and down, it is dynamic and according to what's happening. Public support on both sides is significantly under 50% at this point. Now, whether that's because nobody believes in the idea of it or believes that it can happen and it's not practical, you need to tease that out. But support has significantly declined among both publics.
Right, and I think what we would have to ask is not as much about green lines, but more about red lines and what would be acceptable. And I don't know. Neri, do you want to just
I don't think.
Yeah,
I don't
please.
think there will ever be a Palestinian leader who will accept less than what has been offered in the past. We all know the broad strokes of what that would look like, and it's correct to say even that would be very difficult for any Israeli government to accept. But again, what are your other options? Is it a one-state reality that is essentially the end of the Zionist project? And really, when push comes to shove, and Israeli leaders stop lying to their public that the status quo is sustainable, you may see a shift in terms of the Israeli public to supporting territorial compromise, to uprooting settlements finally in a real manner, to giving up parts of Jerusalem, which Jerusalem is already divided. Anybody that goes there can see that East Jerusalem is not really part of Jewish Israel. So all of that, again, not to belabor the point that we talked about earlier, requires leadership, and that has been in short supply in recent years.
One very quick note. We
30
have
seconds left. Yeah,
yes, we have a one-state reality. It's here. We've had it for decades. This is, in effect, de facto, this is the reality we have. So if you want a one-state reality, here it is. How do you like it?
Right. There were many more questions that we didn't get to. One, to think about, the statement you made, Hussein, about the mutual recognition letters of 1993 and Arafat's subsequent behavior, talking about, Clinton parameters from, the Oslo days, and more about, what would be the expectation set by shrinking the conflict. I think that was a term raised by Micha Goodman, who you can read more about, and we know that he has advised the prime minister on certain aspects. Other questions that came in specifically also about Bennett's government and having members of his cabinet go to sit with Abu Mazen, from the Meretz party, and what does that look like on the ground? Unfortunately, we're leaving with many more questions than I think we have answers, and I think it's our job not to make people feel warm and fuzzy and cozy about it, but to paint an accurate reality. And I think that at least we were able to do, even without leaving so much optimism. I will say, take my prerogative as the rabbi here to remind us all that in the discussion in the Talmud about how to light our candles on Hanukkah, Beit Shammai, of course, started with a full Chanukiah and went down from 8 to 1, and Beit Hillel started from 1 and increased to 8. And that's the custom that was set from there on. And so we take that to learn that we're always trying to increase with a little bit of light and looking for those opportunities to see that. Lucy Ellenbogen, Hussein Ibish, Neri Zilber, thank you so much for your time, for your analysis, for your expertise. Follow all of them on Twitter. Listen to Neri hosting the IPF Policy Forum, a podcast. There's one big glaring question that we didn't address, and that is the civil society element and the
Yeah.
people to people programs and going on there. And the reason that we didn't address that is because we're going to do another webinar about that 1 week from today on December 8th at 1 p.m., same bat time, same bat channel, where we'll be talking to people from the Kids for Peace organization and from the Jerusalem Intercultural Center who are living this reality together on the ground. And I'm glad that we have the political sort of and high-level diplomatic analysis that you all provided in order to then enter into the discussion of civil society. Again, so my deep thanks to Sierra and to Molly from IPF and URJ. And I look forward to seeing you all back again next Wednesday. Happy Hanukkah to everyone, and please stay healthy.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.